welcome everybody. We are so excited to be here today together on Day of Giving for our special continuing education webinar. I'm Charlotte Glen. I am the State Program Manager for the Extension Master Gardener Program here in North Carolina. I have just a few announcements to start us off. Then Mandy Queen is going to join us. She is one of our directors of philanthropy with NC State CALS, College of Ag and Life Science. She's going to talk a little bit about the special challenge gifts we have today before we turn everything over to Dr. Dan Potter, our feature speaker, who's going to talk about trees for bees. I do want to mention today's webinar is sponsored by the Extension Master Gardener Endowment. So when people make gifts to the endowment, that increases the amount of money that stays forever invested and generates interest income to help provide additional funding to support the program all across the state. So if you haven't already, we'd love for you to say hello in chat. Let us know your name and your county. We'd love to see where people are joining us from. If you've got multiple people with you, drop in there how many people are with you, so that helps us understand how many people we have attending today. Also, you may have noticed that we have turned off the ability to unmute your mic on today's webinar because we are expecting quite a large group of people, and we want to minimize disturbances from people accidentally unmuting their mic. But we do encourage you to drop questions in chat as we're going through the presentation. Dr. Potter will respond to questions after his presentation, and we should have plenty of time for that. So as things come up and you have questions, type it in the chat and then hold on till the end and we will get to it. First of all, I want to extend a very heartfelt welcome and thank you. Welcome to everybody here today, but a heartfelt thank you to all of our Master Gardener volunteers and extension professionals all across the state and for the work you're doing. These are just some of our highlights from 2025, just some of the statistics about our number of volunteers. We have over 4,000 amazing volunteers. You give over 244,000 volunteer hours each year, reaching more than 300,000 residents across the state. And if we use the value of volunteer time to calculate what those hours are in value to extension, it's over $8.5 million. But this doesn't really even begin to scratch the surface of the amazing work you're doing every day, the impacts you're having in your community, and the people you're helping. And we'll be highlighting some of that all throughout the month of April on our EMG public website and Facebook page, as April is Global Volunteer Month. So we look forward to celebrating you and celebrating everything you do throughout the month of April. And today, of course, is Day of Giving. And when you make a gift today or any day throughout the year to the NC State Extension Master Gardener Endowment or our program fund, your gifts help support expanding education and training opportunities to our volunteers and our extension professionals. We hopefully will help empower you to do the great work you're doing across the state. And also it's helping to provide new educational resources. And we're very excited to announce that later this spring, we will be launching our Extension Master Gardener Speakers Bureau Library. This will be a growing collection of presentation materials that you will be able to use for extension programming in your counties. They will be ready to go as they are, but of course you'll be able to customize them for your counties as well. So look forward to learning more about that just in another month or two. You will definitely be hearing more. It will be accessible on our EMG intranet, and I will also mention that we targeted that effort for this year to get it started because that was the number one thing that our survey, which we held last summer, and we asked our volunteers and extension professionals, what would most help you be more effective in your communities? That was the number one thing that came back. So we are super excited to be launching that new initiative. And with that, I'm going to ask Mandy Queen, who is one of the directors of Philanthropy at the NC State College of Ag and Life Science, to share a little bit with us about our very special challenge gifts for today, for Day of Giving.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Hey, everybody. As she said, I'm Mandy Queen, and I work for NC State, and I fundraise for the North Carolina Agricultural Foundation, which is where all the support for NC State Extension and our college is routed through. And I also wanted to say happy Day of Giving. And Day of Giving at NC State is just an annual day where we really get excited and emphasize giving and really rally around giving for all areas of the university. And Extension Master Gardeners is a big part of that. And when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk to y'all about and preparing to talk with all of y'all a couple of weeks ago, I did not expect to be able to come on and say congratulations and thank you. We've hit our challenge. But here I am, and I think that's the best case scenario. So I want to say thank you to all of you for what you do as Extension Master Gardener volunteers. I love gardening myself, but anyway, I hope to be able to talk with each of you individually more about gardening. But thank you for what you do as volunteers. Thank you for participating in this challenge. And I don't want to talk too long because I know I'm interrupting this highly anticipated presentation from Dr. Potter. I'm also interested in participating in, but I wanted to say that this year we had a $10,000 challenge gift from an Extension Master Gardener volunteer donor to help encourage other Extension Master Gardener volunteers to participate. That would be unlocked if we raised $5,000, and we have. We'd also had another Extension Master Gardener volunteer make a gift of $5,000 if we were able to unlock 60 gifts. They wanted to make sure that we encouraged participation as much as we did giving and how important participation is. So we've hit that. And I just wanted to share a comparison that last year we had about 46 gifts from 58 donors, raising over $16,000. And so far this year, we've raised over $21,000 combined with the challenge gifts from over 60 gifts. And I haven't even checked it in the last few minutes. And we're just getting started. We are just getting started. Thank you to everybody who's participated. For those of you who might not have participated yet or considering making a gift, please do see what else we can do. Let's move the bar a little bit further so that we can continue to build on this year after year. I was excited just for us to start doing this last year, and I'm really excited to see what we will be able to do this year and continue this in the future. I also wanted to say, you can participate in Day of Giving not just by making a gift. Of course, you're welcome to do that. And in addition to doing that, please engage with us on social media. I saw Floy was here, and Floy provided a wonderful video for us on social media. Please go to our state pages and our county pages and interact by liking and commenting and sharing so that we can have a reach just as much that way. Also, I'd invite for you all to share your story. There are lots of people all across the university today sharing their story on social media with pictures of them. I would love to see lots of Extension Master Gardeners with pictures of them in their gardens or at the Arboretum doing volunteer work so that more people in the NC State University community are aware of you and what you do. I'm going to be hanging out for the duration of the call, and I'm going to be in the chat. I'm going to take off my video, but I'll be in the chat, and I'm going to put some links down there to make a gift, to links for sharing your story on social media, and along with my contact information. If after the call you'd like to get in touch with me, I'd very much welcome that. I love working with Extension Master Gardeners. And I think that's really all I have to say. If I've missed anything, let me know. But like I said, I'll be in the chat. Thank you all again so much for letting me interrupt this. And I just appreciate you all so much.
Thank you, Mandy, for all of your support. Mandy's been a tremendous help in our efforts around Day of Giving and fund development for the Extension Master Gardener program. We certainly appreciate her. Okay, with that, it is time for the main show. And we are delighted to once again welcome back Dr. Daniel Potter for our special Day of Giving webinar. You may remember Dr. Potter was our speaker last year. He spoke on building better monarch butterfly gardens. It was an excellent presentation. It was based on research he and his graduate students had been involved in. We enjoyed it so much, we wanted to bring him back again this year to talk about trees for bees. So Dr. Potter is a professor emeritus in the Department of Entomology at the University of Kentucky, where he spent 44 years conducting research on managing pests and conserving beneficial insects in urban landscapes. He is an award-winning teacher and internationally recognized speaker, having presented at conferences, workshops, and public programs around the world. Dr. Potter is also an elected fellow of the Entomological Society of America and has received national leadership awards from organizations including the Professional Land Care Network, American Nursery and Landscape Association, and the U.S. Golf Association. So today, Dr. Potter will share his research to help us better understand how trees and shrubs can support bee populations in our landscapes and how we can apply that knowledge in our communities. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Potter.
Hey, Charlotte, I really appreciate the invitation to come back and speak. I retired about 2.5 years ago, and I really miss the classroom. So it's a privilege to get a chance to talk to your distinguished group and to exercise my teaching chops a little bit. I'm going to do a little teaching about pollination ecology and bees to start my talk, and then I'm going to spend the bulk of it on a major research project that we did near the end of my career concerning the best trees and shrubs for bee conservation. So let's go ahead and get started. And I thought this slide might get your attention. Why is there sex? This is a G-rated presentation, so I realize we could answer that question in various ways. But I'm sure that as biologists, you realize that we have this because it allows outcrossing, and outcrossing yields genetic diversity and offspring. And that's a good strategy in a variable, uncertain world. It's better if you want to win at the game of life to hold a number of different lottery tickets than to put all your eggs into one basket. Now, unlike chipmunks, plants can't move to find a mate. So we might ask, how do they gain the benefits of outcrossing? And I think as biologists, you all are aware that plants gain outcrossing through the process of pollination, which is the movement of the pollen grains, which contain the male gametes or sperm cells, by some outside agent from the male portions of the plant, the anthers, to the female portions of a different plant, where the pollen grains will germinate and grow down into the ovary and fertilize the eggs down there, which develop into seeds. Now, some plants are wind pollinated, and they use wind as the outside agent. These include many deciduous trees, such as the willows and birches and oaks and alders. You can recognize these by the catkins that hang down often. And most conifers are wind pollinated, and grasses and cereal crops. And I know this very well because my seasonal allergies here in Kentucky have been particularly bad this year, and maybe the same with you. If we look at this close up of oak flowers, they don't seem to have obvious flowers, but the male flowers, in fact, are the ones on the right. And this is typical of wind-pollinated plants. They're pendulous and they hang down and they shed lots of pollen into the air. The female flowers are tiny and inconspicuous, but if we look closely, we can see that they do contain a sticky stigma, which is adapted for trapping pollen from the air. And the male and female flower parts will ripen at different times on an individual tree to help minimize the prospects of self-pollination, and we therefore can ensure that the flowers are pollinated by a different tree. Now, wind pollination is not very efficient. You're shedding huge amounts of pollen into the air. We typically find it in monocultures of trees like conifers in the Canadian taiga ecosystems or grasslands, where the plants are close enough together to pretty much ensure that your pollen is going to get to the right place. But in more mixed habitats, it's much more common for a different type of outside agents to move the pollen. Again, wind pollination is not very efficient, and I have a box of tissues right on my desk here, just in case I get a pollen attack during this talk. Plants long ago began to utilize biotic pollinators for more efficient transfer of pollen, and our angiosperm plants typically do this. Some plants utilize the services of bats or mice or other small mammals. Some utilize the services of birds, sunbirds in the tropics and hummingbirds here. Most plants utilize the services of insects, flowering plants, that is. Now, here's an example of bat-pollinated plant. There is a fun fact. They're the primary pollinators of agave used to make tequila. So if you like margaritas, you should thank a bat. I'm going to a Peruvian restaurant tonight, and I'll be thanking the bats. If you see trumpet-shaped red flowers like the ones here, it's a pretty good bet in our neck of the woods that they're pollinated by hummingbirds. Most insects don't see the color red, and they couldn't reach the nectar at the bottom of those flowers anyway. So it's not an accident that our hummingbird feeders have a red top to them and they have deep and they're loaded up with a very rich sugary blend that would reward these hummingbirds. But most, anywhere between 3/4 and 85% of flowering plants are pollinated by insects. And it's interesting to ask why. Well, in order to understand the answer to that question, we have to think in terms of floral rewards, nectar and pollen, which are costly for plants to produce. Of course, the insects and birds and bats don't visit these plants out of the kindness of their hearts. They do it as a kind of mutualism from which they get a floral reward. Nectar is produced in nectaries, the secretory glands that are usually at the base of sepals. And you can see this honeybee here sipping the nectar from a little cup at the base of that hollyflower where the nectar is located. Bees, butterflies, and many other insects rely on nectar as their main energy source. It's rich in carbohydrates and sugars, and it helps fuel their flight and their colony activities and their body heat, much the way an energy drink would be useful to a long distance runner or a sprinter. Now, pollen's high in protein and other nutrients, and adult bees need it for health and reproduction. Female bees won't mature their eggs without having some pollen in their or some protein in their diet, and pollen is the main source. And bee larvae need pollen to grow. And you can see in this mason bee nest on the right side of the images here, the pollen bowls that were provisioned by the female bee, and the little baby bees, the grubs, need to just lift their little necks up there and take a bite of pollen whenever they feel hungry. Now, why do most flowering plants rely on insects? Again, the answer really lies in the fact that insects are ubiquitous, they're small, and that makes them very cost effective from the perspective of the plant. They require a smaller floral reward than do bees or bats, and they're around all the time during the growing season. So you can see it takes a lot more nectar to reward a honeybee and keep them coming back than it does to reward an insect like a bee or another small pollinator. Here's another question you maybe haven't thought about. Why do plants invest in flowers? What are flowers for? I mean, they're nice at Valentine's Day, but in reality, flowers serve the same purpose as these do. You're driving down the road trying to decide whether you're going to have some bad tacos or a greasy hamburger, and these businesses are advertising for your attention and your money and your investment. And the same is true with the flowering plants. The petals are advertisements to compete and attract bees and other pollinators. Why do we care about bees? Well, I think most of us know that insect pollination services are very important for global food production. And it's been estimated at a $500 billion a year. In fact, I don't know that anybody knows for sure what the exact value is, but we do know that without bees, all of this good stuff would be off the menu. The fruits, many of our vegetables, and many of our nuts and seeds would be off the menu as well. Some years ago, some scientists put together this graphic, your breakfast with bee pollination and without bees. And you can see, of course, the jelly's gone, and so is the fruit, the melons, the strawberries, the almonds are gone, the fruit juice is gone. I had to scratch my head a little bit about why there's no cream in the coffee, but it turns out that the cows feed upon alfalfa and clover, which is bee pollinated. So we would have a much more boring diet if it wasn't for bees. In California, it takes nearly 3 million honeybee colonies that have to be carted in on trucks or trucked in order to pollinate these vast monocultures of almonds and other crops that are grown in that part of the world. And the reason is there simply aren't enough native bees around in these ecosystems to get the job done. So we have to rely upon commercial pollination by bringing in the bees. And another interesting example of why bees are so important is that in parts of China, heavy agricultural spraying has nearly wiped out the local bees. And the farmers have to resort to hand pollination of millions of flowers. And they hire families, often with little kids, that climb up into the trees. They give them a bamboo stick with a brush on the end and a jar of apple pollen, and they tediously and meticulously have to pollinate every flower because there aren't enough bees around. Why do we care about wild bees? We say that they're keystone species for biodiversity, and we all know what a keystone is in an architectural arch. If you pull it out, the whole building collapses. And that's true of the value of these bees and the role of these bees in natural ecosystems, pollinating wild plants that produce fruit that feeds birds and other wildlife and also seeds and supports the whole food chain. This is a scene of Raven Run where I'm going to walk with my granddaughters next week, and the wildflowers are out in profusion. And if we look closely at these flowers, they're almost all pollinated by wild or native bees at this time of the year. About 80% of the flowering plants around the world rely upon not honeybees, but wild native bees. And why do we care about urban bees? Well, besides the fact that we should care and we have lots of wildflowers in our urban neighborhoods, bees also pollinate our gardens, our orchards, and the plants that provide food for urban wildlife. We wouldn't have the pretty holly berries or the ornamental crab apples on our ornamental trees if it wasn't for bee pollination. And the pollination of melons and tomatoes and other edible plants is very important increasingly for food security for people in urban areas. Now, bees and wasps aren't the same. Sometimes I hear people say, I don't like bees. They sting me. I'm scared of them. Well, they're not the same thing. Bees and wasps feed their young on pollen and nectar. Bees are herbivores. Adult bees are fuzzy and they have branched feathery hairs that are adapted to trap pollen. And then the bees groom themselves and they will often pack the pollen into special structures like the baskets on the hind legs of the honeybee that you can see here, or perhaps on the belly of the bee. And they will bring it back and they will feed a load of nectar and also pollen to their larvae to help them to grow. So they have to visit flowers to get these floral resources. Wasps, on the other hand, are carnivores. They're meat eaters. Most wasps are bald or they have very little hair, and if they have hair, it's straight and not fuzzy. And they feed their young on meat, typically chewed up insect meatballs. They catch caterpillars, they chop them up, chew them up, and bring them back and feed them to the larvae. If you see yellow jackets visiting watermelon or visiting your canned soft drinks in the fall at your picnic, it's because they're seeking the sugars as fuel for their own flight. And by the way, back in the sixth grade, my son did a project looking at diet drinks versus regular drinks. And if you don't want yellow jackets at your picnic, go with the diet drinks. They're not attracted to the artificial sugar. Okay, so honeybees are docile unless their hive is threatened, and native bees rarely sting. They're sort of gentle little things. Most of the wasp stings that occur in urban settings that people get upset about are from wasps, especially yellow jacket wasps, and almost all of those are invasive species in our neck of the woods. So if people want to get rid of their invasive yellow jackets, I'm okay with that if it's a hazard, but don't blame the bees for those problems. Now, one last thing I want to say about bees before we meet them is that we can divide the bees into two major groups, the social bees, the ones that are most familiar to us, the bumblebees and the honeybees, which live in colonies with a queen and workers, and then all the bees in the colony cooperate to raise the young and maintain the nest. Typically, with bumblebees, the queen overwinters somewhere in a sheltered place like a hollow log or under the leaves, and she begins to forage on her. She's already fertilized from the previous year. She forages and begins to lay eggs. And then once the first brood of workers comes up, they go out and do the foraging, and the queen stays home to lay all the eggs. And then in the late summer, new queens are produced and males are produced, and there's mating, and those fertilized queens go and overwinter to complete the cycle. But most of our bees aren't like that. Most of our native species are solitary bees, where each female is in it for herself. She builds and provisions her own simple nest in the ground, in hollow stems, or in wood. And we're going to talk more about them a little bit later. So the adult emerges in the spring, she forages, she makes a nest underground or in a hollow stem. She provisions it with pollen, and then she lays eggs in there. Honeybees aren't native to America. They were brought here, we know, to the Jamestown, Virginia colony first in 1622, just 2 years after the Mayflower landed at Plymouth, Massachusetts. And bees have been kept in cultivation ever since. And in fact, most honeybees in North America are maintained as kind of managed livestock, if you will. But besides honeybees, we have thousands of species of native bees that provide pollination services in the United States. And some of these bees are absolutely gorgeous. I think they're just as cute as a panda or that monkey that's been in the news, Punch the Monkey. If you look at them up close and personal, they're just adorable. So let's meet them in a little bit more detail before we begin to talk about trees for bees. One group that's very important from the standpoint of trees and bee conservation are the Andrenidae, the mining bees. These are bees that make nests in the soil, and they're particularly active early in the spring. They're very important pollinators of spring blooming fruit trees and berry crops like these blueberries here. And again, if I go for my walk in the woods next week and look at the wildflowers, most of the bees on these wildflowers here in March or April are going to be Andrenid bees. The Halictidae, the sweat bees, are some of my favorites. Many of them are beautiful green metallic in color. In fact, if you spot a green metallic bee on flowers, it's a good bet it's in this family. Most of these nest in the soil, but some nest in rotting wood as well. And they're very important pollinating a wide range of woody and herbaceous plants throughout the growing season from spring to autumn. And here are just some more examples of beautiful halictid bees close up. The Megachilidae, the mason, leafcutter, and resin bees, carry pollen on their bellies, on the underside of the abdomen. If you see a bee in the field with the yellow pollen all over its underside, it's a good bet it's a Megachilid bee. They're the only ones that carry it that way. And they nest in pithy stems, wood, or below ground. And here you can see how they've provisioned a hollow stem with pollen for their larvae to feed on. The Megachilidae visit diverse perennials and woody plants. Some of them, like the blue orchard bee on the right, are very important pollinators of tree fruit crops, even more effective than honeybees are. And then finally, the more familiar bees, the Apidae, the bumblebees, the carpenter bees, and the western honeybee. Again, the one on the right being a non-native species that exists mostly in domesticated form. Bumblebees and western honeybees are our social bees that live in social colonies. We all know how honeybees live. Bumblebees live in colonies that are typically in the ground. Often they make their nests in abandoned chipmunk burrows or similar types of cavities. And they pollinate lots of wild and cultivated plants, including major food crops. Now, if you're interested in learning more about bees, these are two wonderful books, and I want to show you that I do have them right here next to my desk. I look at them all the time because I'm not really a bee expert, but these are two of my favorite books on bees and highly recommend them for your bookshelf if you'd like to learn more. Now, wild bees and honeybees and other pollinators have been having a tough time of it. That's why you hear so many talks about save the bees, conserve the bees. And there are a number of reasons why this is true. Honeybees are having a tough time, but so are the wild bees. Honeybee colonies could face potential losses as high as 70% this year again, impacting agriculture. And there are a number of reasons why honeybees are threatened. The biggest one is the varroa mite. This is a parasitic mite. It's an invasive mite that's a threat to honeybee culture pretty much worldwide. They feed on the vital bee tissues and they also transmit deadly bee diseases. So you can see a bunch of these mites that are attached to the different life stages of the bees here. And it's a little bit like having something the size of a dinner plate attached to your back with its mouth part stuck in, feeding on your tissues. It's not going to make your day go any better. And some of these have 5 or 6. This is the number one problem that's affecting honeybees worldwide. They also carry some diseases. Some of these diseases are carried by the mites, others are not. But honeybees are facing a variety of exotic bee diseases that are contributing to their decline. But the fact is that honeybee colony numbers in North America are stable. They're not in any danger of going extinct. The reason is that most of our honeybees are managed as semi-domesticated livestock. So the beekeepers can intensify their practices, they can requeen their colonies. It's an economic problem for the beekeeping industry, but it's not a problem from the standpoint of environmental biodiversity loss in this case. But native bees are declining too. And this is a big concern because most of these are not managed by us. And there's a reason for that. Native bees are declining in particular because of habitat loss. And I know that all of us are familiar with subdivisions that look a lot like this, and there's just not a lot to offer bees as far as resources here. Most of our bees are ground nesters. And again, if we go back and look at that habitat with a perfectly manicured lawns covered with turf grass and so on, there's very little bare ground for these bees to make their nests. Many of our other native bees rear their young in cavities or hollow stems, and there's not a whole lot of standing goldenrod or similar types of habitat in neighborhoods like this either. So this is one of the reasons why native bees are declining. All bees are declining due to other environmental stressors, climate change, agricultural intensification resulting in giant monocultures. You look at that cornfield, it's going to only shed pollen for about 2 weeks during the year, and bees can't subsist on just corn pollen alone. It would be like you feeding them potato chips for 2 weeks. So this is a problem, and of course, so is acute and chronic exposure to pesticides. So in summary, the reason why we're concerned about bee conservation is that our pollinators, especially bees, are facing a perfect storm of stresses at the present time. Mites, diseases, pesticide exposures, habitat loss, and climate change. It's agreed by scientists that the best way we can help urban pollinators is to give them more and better food. And that's where we come in. There's an enormous body of research, ongoing research at NC State, at University of Georgia, and all over the world, in fact, showing that well-designed urban gardens can be refuges for bees and other pollinators. The city can be a refuge for native bees. So a word or two about building a bee-friendly flower garden before we get to trees for bees. You want to use plants that bloom at different times of the growing season to provide nectar and pollen from early spring throughout the autumn. The key is to have floral resources available throughout the growing season. You want to include a mix of colors and shapes that will attract a variety of bees and other pollinators. In other words, diversify your garden, both temporally and from the standpoint of the types of flowers. If you're interested in some great information on the best types of herbaceous plants for pollinator gardens, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation has a wonderful handouts. I believe I sent these to Charlotte to post on the website for the conference. And the Pollinator Partnership also has some wonderful lists of this type of thing. But we're concerned today with trees and shrubs. Woody landscape plants too can provide critical resources for bees, and these don't get as much attention as do the annuals and the perennial herbaceous plants. Woody landscape plants provide food, of course, pollen and nectar if they're flowering plants, but they also provide nesting sites, nest building materials, and overwintering sites. And this is the topic I want to spend the rest of this presentation on. So woody plants provide nesting sites for bees. I've already touched on this. They may be hollow stems, they may be cavities and dead logs and so on. They may be materials to make the nests from. We see some images here. Now, who knows what caused this? I'm going to give you a moment to guess. We don't have time to put it in the chat or anything, but take a guess. This is a very common sight to see in urban settings, and it's caused by leafcutter bees. You can see this bee cutting this very perfectly semicircular piece of leaf here, and it will sort of take it back and it uses it to kind of create a lining for its nest inside of a stem or a cavity. So this is another way that trees can help bees to provision what they need, is providing the leaves that are used by these types of bees. Some bees use woody plant resins for nest building. Honeybees, for example, collect resin to make propolis, and propolis is sort of like the caulking in a bee colony. They use it to fill the cracks and crevices, to help to weatherproof the nest and that sort of thing. So resins from trees are very important there. And there are resin bees that collect resins and other resins to cap their nests, like the solitary bee you see on the right. So this is something we often don't think about, that woody plants provide for bees, that they absolutely have to have, at least some species. Woody plants provide overwintering sites for bees. The small carpenter bee and the raspberry cane. It will spend the winter there and emerge in the spring. Bumblebee queens that burrow under fallen leaves. There's an increasing body of information coming out, some of it from NC State, that leaving leaves in your garden or even a light coating of leaves on the lawn is very important for overwintering of bees and certain other beneficial insects. Now, the most important thing that trees provide for bees, though, are the floral resources from the pollen and nectar. And it's clear that a single tree or shrub can provide thousands of flowers with high quality pollen and nectar for bees. Just a couple of images to reinforce that: Kentucky yellowwood and the summer sweet clethra. Blooming trees can be perhaps called meadows in the sky. And this graphic came from a paper I read where they projected all of the flowers for the given space down onto a flat plane. And you can see on the right that if we dropped all the flowers out of that flowering tree, it would be a much higher density of floral resources than provided by this flower-rich meadow on the left. And in fact, scientists have calculated that 2 mature blooming linden trees can produce as much nectar when they're in bloom as an acre of sweet clover. The citations are on the bottom. Now, it's a lot easier to plant a couple of blooming linden trees than to maintain an acre of sweet clover in your backyard. Anyway, makes the point. We did a big research project toward the end of my career. It started about 2015, and it was done primarily by my second to last PhD student, Bernie Mock, who then went down to University of Florida. And this project was funded by the Horticultural Research Institute with the American Hort Endowment that funded a lot of our pollinator work. So I want to thank them and acknowledge their support. When we looked at the literature, we saw that there was an absolute list mania of information about herbaceous plants that were good for bees, but almost nothing in the literature about which woody plants were the best, and particularly what types of bees were attracted to different types of woody plants. This is, for example, from the Pollinator Partnership website, one of the best sources for this sort of information. And you can see the plants that attract pollinators: acer, maples, serviceberry. And you can see down there visitation by pollinators, bees, flies. And we asked, what type of bees? That's not very specific. How bee attractive is it? Is maple more or less attractive than a serviceberry? So we decided to conduct a big research project that formed a big part of Bernie Mock's PhD work. We sampled 75 species of woody landscape plants with 5 sites per plant species. So there were several hundred sites. And you don't see all the plants here. This is just to show you that we had quite a variety of different types of flower forms and trees and shrubs. We did this for 3 years, over 375 sample sites in central Kentucky, southern Indiana, and southern Ohio. Now, the good news is that our latitude is almost exactly the same as where you are, so the information we got should be completely appropriate for North Carolina as well. We sampled residential and commercial and institutional landscapes, campuses, arboreta, cemeteries, street trees, all sorts of sites. At each site, we compared the plant's attractiveness to the bees using snapshot counts, timed observations where we counted the bees visiting. And then we collected and identified 50 bee samples from each of 5 sites, 250 bees per plant species. There were no endangered species or anything like that. And many of the bees we were able to identify without actually hurting them, the honeybees and the bumblebees. So we had quite a large sample of bees that we were able to identify. We published this work in open access online scientific journals where anyone can download and read them for free. This is one of the scientific papers that came from this. I don't expect you to read it, but you can if you want to. You can look it up, Mock and Potter, woody plant bees, and you'll find it. But let me sum it up for you. And I also have a handout that we posted that provides some of the key information. Here are some key points of what we learned from the study. Different woody ornamentals attract unique bee assemblages. And you can see that from this image, even if you're not an entomologist. On the left, we can see that flowering crabapple attracts quite a diversity of small, diverse bees, lots of andrenid bees, halictid bees, megachilid bees, whereas the fuzzy deutzia is dominated by apid bees, particularly carpenter bees and some others. If you have a wooden garage and you're concerned about carpenter bees, you might not want to put a fuzzy deutzia right next to it. But anyway, you can see that they're quite different. The diversity of bees visiting varies by plant species, and it's not necessarily associated with native plants or non-native plants. On the left, we can see mock orange. This was a native variety, native species, and you can see it's absolutely dominated by one small bee. This little bee, it's a megachilid bee. That's a resin gatherer, and we don't exactly know what it's doing with the resin that it's scraping from the flowers of mock orange, but it sure is attracted to that plant. The chase tree on the right is a non-native plant, and you can see that the diversity in types of bees is much greater for that plant species. Okay, flower form matters. We saw this throughout all the different species, and we did look at a number of cultivars as well as a sub-study. Open flowered plants tend to attract lots of bees, as you can see with the prairie rose, but the horticulturally modified varieties like hybrid tea roses that have double petals, virtually no bees attracted to those. The plants that are covered with sterile sepals, like the mop top hydrangeas, are not attracting very many bees at all, if any, whereas the open flowered ones like the hydrangea paniculata were quite bee attractive. So in general, plants that have sterile sepals covering up the flower parts or double petals, not very attractive to bees. That can be good news in some cases, because if you've grown hybrid tea roses, you know they're prone to Japanese beetles and aphids and other kinds of pests. And it's okay to spray your hybrid tea roses for Japanese beetles, because that's not going to be much of a hazard, if any, to bees. They're not going there anyway. Again, across the different species we looked at, single flower is good. This is cherry blossoms, but double flowered plants, not much there for the bees. Are natives best for bees? This is a big question, and you're all familiar with Doug Tallamy and Bringing Nature Home and the native plant movement. We were interested in whether or not this would matter to the bees. And we found that there's a lot of variability both within native and non-native woody plant species, and it doesn't seem to matter across the board one way or another. It's more important, more dependent on the species than whether it's a native or non-native. So we have some native plants that are not so attractive or somewhat attractive. And then we have some non-native ones that fall into the same category, like common lilac. But we have some native ones that are extremely attractive, bee magnets, if you will, and some non-native ones as well. And we saw no overall difference in native versus non-native, but lots of species variability. This is a daunting looking graph, but it's a very simple one if you really want to get the gist of it. It simply shows that the bee assemblages that visit woody plants change through the growing season. The Julian date is the number of days since the new year. So from left to right, we go later into the growing season. You can see that the andrenidae are very abundant in the springtime, early in the spring, March and April. So we want to have food available for them. The halictidae, they increase during the growing season, as do the bumblebees. The honeybees are around all year round. So the key here is we want to provide forage for the bees throughout the growing season. They need season-long resources if we're going to have a variety of bees. Early season plants that bloom in February to April, mid-season plants, and we typically have plenty of those around, and then also some late season plants to support our bumblebee queens that are going into hibernation so that our honeybees can beef up before the winter season, and our solitary bees that are going into hibernation can also have some resources toward the end of the growing season. Early in spring is the time when food is scarcest in Kentucky and in North Carolina, so it's very important to provide resources at those times. Now, another fact is that introduced woody plants typically retain the timing of their natal region. And we saw this over and over again in our surveys. 80% of the trees and shrubs that bloomed before April 1 or after July 1 were non-native species. Okay, so our native species tend to bloom in May and June, maybe into July, but most of the ones at the other ends of the growing season were the non-natives. Key point, non-native woody plants can extend the flowering season, providing food for bees when native plant resources are limiting. Now, I'm not talking about invasive species, aristocrat pears, and things like that. And we're talking about ornamental trees, not trees that we would put out into a nature center or a natural area, but we're talking about trees in urban settings. And here's two examples, Cornelian cherry dogwood, which blooms in March, beautiful tree, and Korean baby tree. I'll talk more about these later, blooming in September. So let me show you a few examples of the variety of trees that attract lots of bees, and then I'll show you a handout that I've posted that will be a good resource, I think, for remembering some of these and as a reference for later. Look at all the different beautiful trees and shrubs that are absolute bee magnets, black gum and yellowwood, winged sumac, devil's walking stick. And a lot of these are ones that not everybody has either. So they make interesting specimens in one's home landscape. Here's a lot of examples of bee attractive native shrubs. And some of these I didn't even know what they were until we started to do the study. But all of these are absolute bee magnets. But here are some examples of non-native bees and non-native trees that are bee attractive. The Hegan cherries. The cherries that are around the National Mall in Washington, D.C. are, of course, gifts from Japan. And they're absolutely covered with bees at this time of year. And many others. The seven sunflower on the lower right is one of my favorites, and it's an absolute bee magnet. And so is the Cornelian cherry dogwood. And here are examples of bee attractive non-native shrubs. Glossolabilia is one of my favorites. It blooms into October here in Kentucky and is still feeding bumblebee queens before they go into their overwintering. So lots and lots of variety. Now, one of the things I did from that study was take the scientific paper and distill it down into this handout, Trees for Bees, which contains the key information from the study with a list of plants, when they bloom, and whether they're native or non-native plants. And this is posted on the website for this particular talk and conference. And I hope it's something that'll be useful to you as a takeaway from the talk. There were a number of other questions we looked at. Do native woody plants provide higher quality floral resources than non-natives, or are the non-native nectar and pollen maybe junk food for bees? This was a legitimate question that I got in one of my presentations a few years ago. Bernie did some analyses of the quality, the amino acid content and such of the pollen and the sugar content and the different sugars in the nectar. We analyzed sugars and protein amino acids from these groups of native and non-native plants. And to make a long story short, the findings were that both of these types of plants, native and non-native, can provide high quality food and supported many species of native bees. There were slight differences among the different species of plants, as you would expect, but no overarching difference between native and non-native pollen or nectar. So it's not junk food. And you can see that with your own eyes. This is a seven sunflower tree that is outside the place where my office is. And I used to walk by it every day when I parked my truck and came into work. And this was a series of pictures I took on just one day of the tree covered with honeybees, bumblebee queens, halictid bees, and I counted 12 monarch butterflies nectaring on this plant on their way back to Mexico. So this is a non-native tree that supports lots of native pollinators as well as honeybees. Should we plant native plants only or a mix? And again, I know this is a hotly debated topic. I'm not going to resolve that question today or that debate, but I would suggest consider this 70 to 30 guideline. We want to plant predominantly native plants because, as Doug Tallamy and others have pointed out, these are the plants that support the caterpillars and other insects that tend to be the basis for our native food webs. If you want to grow caterpillars and feed chickadees, the natives are really the way to go. But the non-natives can also be very valuable, especially for variety. And again, my point is to help extend the flowering season for pollinators, bees and butterflies. So consider a mix, but of course, if we're going to go exotic, only the non-natives, and only we're talking about ornamental landscapes and urban and suburban settings, not nature preserves. Okay? Many of the best bee magnets are also nearly pest-free. I'm an entomologist, and I really can't name any significant pests of these bee magnets. And that's a good thing, because if we keep planting some of the plants that are overplanted, are boxwoods, are flowering crab apples, things that are really buggy, that get tent caterpillars and boxwood leaf miners and other things, they end up getting sprayed, and that becomes a bee hazard. These are some plants that really don't need to be treated with pesticides, and that's a good thing. Wind pollinated plants are another thing that's often overlooked. And even though they might be predominantly wind pollinated, some of them still attract the bees for the pollen or both pollen and nectar. Maples, for example, the red and sugar maples, produce both pollen and nectar, and they are absolute bee magnets in the early spring. The bees come to the oaks, the elms, the pussy willows, and filberts to gather the pollen as a food resource. So don't overlook these as well. So how to build a bee-friendly landscape? Plant a variety of trees and shrubs that bloom at different times of the growing season. Want to particularly pay attention to early spring and autumn, when there tends to be a dearth of native plants that are blooming in our landscapes in this part of the United States. You can build a bee-friendly landscape by looking at the handout I posted or your own observations and planting a variety that bloom from spring or early summer or late summer. In other words, choose some from each column. Again, pointing you to this new Trees for Bees handout that's just put together for this conference, in fact, and that should point you in the right direction. I want to just talk about a few of my favorite native and non-native plants for bees. I've already mentioned red and sugar maples. I thought that maples were predominantly wind pollinated, but with a little library research, I learned that these also produce nectar. So in spite of being mainly wind pollinated, they are supplemented by bees, and the bees certainly visit them in droves to gather these floral resources in March and April. Pussy willow, I took this picture outside our building, and pussy willow and other willows, a great bee magnet very early in the spring. Northern spice bush. I took the pictures here yesterday. Not all of them. Some of them came from North Carolina State, in fact. But the bee in the upper right I took yesterday. It cost me 6 chigger bites getting that picture. But my point is that it's March here, and the bees are already all over the northern spice bush. Serviceberry. I have one in my yard. It's in bloom right now. The bees love it. They love it. Redbud, particularly for the andrenid bees and the megachilid bees, that's a blue orchard bee there, is another great native bee magnet in the early spring. Non-native early spring bee magnets, cornelian cherry dogwood and Japanese cornel dogwood are two of my favorites. Beautiful trees. They don't get any pests, and they are bee magnets in very early spring and in late winter. So here's a couple pictures I took on my walks at our Lexington Arboretum of Japanese cornel dogwood, and the Cornus moss is right near it, February 21 and March 7. And these trees were already in bloom, and they already were covered with honeybees, getting an early start on their year. Flowering crab apples. Again, they can be buggy with tent caterpillars and things, but there's ways of dealing with those. These are great bee magnets early in the spring. The various flowering prunus, cherries and plums, both the native and the non-native species that have single petals are absolute bee magnets. Again, both native and non-native are great. The hawthorns, Washington hawthorn, winter king hawthorn, covered with bees. And of course, you wouldn't have the beautiful fall fruits if it wasn't for the bees. Winterberry holly. I have 5 in my backyard, and I love them in the wintertime. But again, you have to have a male and a female, at least one male on your landscape or nearby for pollination. If it wasn't for the bees, we wouldn't have the beautiful red fruits. But they are also very good for feeding bees in the springtime. Now, late summer is another time when our native plants are often not in bloom. And some of the ones that are, though, are the shining smooth and winged sumacs. And these are amazing bee magnets. They may not fit in every landscape, but the bees sure do love them, as you can see here. I took this little video of Devil's Walking Stick on one of my walks. I'm going to dare show it, but it just gives you the idea. I'm pretty proud of that. Probably the first one I ever took with my cell phone. But Devil's Walking Stick is another native late bee magnet that is just an amazing tree. And not everybody has one. They're really pretty neat trees. Okay. Summer Sweet, Clethra, is a great late season bee magnet, August and September. And this one here is again one of my favorites, the Korean BB tree. This is a non-native. I found this video online and it has a funky soundtrack, but this is exactly what I've seen too in the field. Have a look at this.
This is my 5-year-old
There we
baby tree or Korean Evodia tree in my front yard. And the bees are just tearing up the blossoms.
All right, enough of that. Good. Still with me? Okay. Glossobelia. I've already talked about this one. It blooms actually up into November in Kentucky. The bumblebee queens absolutely love this in the late fall, and I highly recommend it. It's a non-native, though. Seven sunflower, another one of my favorite non-natives. As far as I know, it's not invasive in any way, used in a landscape, and many bees on the seven sunflower tree. Okay, so those are some nice examples of some of the ones that we found and that I see every day on my walks that are just bee magnets. What else can you do to help bees? You can provide nesting habitat. About 30% of our native bees rear their young in cavities or hollow stems, as you see here. Now, this is something that a lot of people, I think, have been interested in building these or buying these bee hotels. There's a body of new research coming out suggesting that these bee hotels may in fact be death traps for native bees. The high density housing encourages parasites and diseases. By packing all the bees into such a small area, if you get an outbreak of fungi or parasitic bees come in, or other types of threats to the bees, you can take them all out at one time. So the suggestions from the ecologists who study these things are that although they might be good teaching tools and it's not going to be a big deal if you put out 1 or 2 small ones, this is not really going to be the best way to help save our native bees. The original bee hotels, the original Airbnbs, if you will, were snags and dead wood and hollow reeds and stems. And the consensus these days is that these are better than manufactured bee hotels. And the best way to do that, or one of the best ways, is to leave hollow or pithy stems to create bee nesting habitat. And this is pretty easy to do by simply modifying your pruning practices just a little bit. And I posted this nifty handout that comes from the Xerces Society and other collaborators on how to create stem nesting bee habitat by cutting back your dead flower stalks and leaving stubble in the springtime where the bees can come and use it for their nests, and then allowing the plants to grow up and hide that stubble, and then the bees overwintering in the stems during the winter, and then cutting back the dead flower stalks later after the bees have emerged, or allowing them to fall to the ground where the bees will emerge in that way. So I'm not going to say too much more about that, but this seems to be a more effective way of helping to conserve native stem nesting bees. And there are lists on the handout that I posted of some good plants for stem nesting bees, and these are listed here. And you don't need to write them all down because, again, they're in the handout. I have some of these in my own backyard, and I'm going to be watching them to see what kind of bees colonize them this year. There's been the suggestion in the literature that small bundles of hollow stalks placed around a property make really good Airbnbs. I know Doug Tallamy recommends simply harvesting these stems, bundling a few loosely together with a piece of string or a rubber band, and then scattering them about your property in the way that you see there. Or you can take the spent flower stalks and bundle them up, cut them off, and leave them upright, and they will be colonized by stem nesting bees. Wood nesting bees, mason bees, leaf cutting bees will adopt burrows left by beetles in dead wood. And if your landscape allows it, you can leave these kinds of natural bee hotels, stumps with holes in them, hollow logs, snags of this type, and they will be used by these mason bees and leaf cutting bees. It's kind of neat. So again, I posted this handout as well on your website, how to create nesting habitat, and this has a lot of additional tips on how to do it. It's a really nice handout from the Xerces Society. So I'm almost done. For you take-home points. Bees benefit agriculture and urban habitats. We wouldn't have our beautiful hollyberries or ornamental crab apples, no blueberries, no tomatoes, no cantaloupes, no strawberries if it wasn't for our friends, the bees. So very important that we conserve them in urban settings. Diversify landscapes with pest-resistant woody and herbaceous plants. Bees like a variety of plants. You will have a variety of bees if you diversify and emphasize plants that bloom throughout the growing season, at least having a mix that do that. Emphasize native plants, but it's okay, in my view, to include some non-native, non-invasive plants to extend the flowering season and perhaps provide some variety as well. Cultivars, too, are fine as long as they're not double-petaled cultivars, which don't provide much food for bees. Double-petaled cultivars are fine just because they're pretty, but they're not going to be great for bee food. Trees and shrubs are an important part of bee-friendly landscapes that are often overlooked in our recommendations, but they should be included. And I'll end with this nice quote from Akiva Silver's book, Trees of Power. Planting trees is a powerful act. We can influence the lives of people and wildlife for centuries with a successful planting. So with that, I think I'm done in time, exactly 1 hour. And I think there's probably some time for questions. Is that right, Charlotte?
That is correct. And we have
Great.
some great
This was
questions.
the first time I've ever given this talk. So thank you for giving me a chance to test drive it. I hope it went over okay.
It was fantastic. So we appreciate the test audience. I have been tracking some of the questions that have been coming in. So we do, as you said, have plenty of time for questions. So I will read some of them to you and you can respond. So
Okay.
first up, there was a question, just curious if you're a beekeeper.
No, I'm not a beekeeper. I have taken a class in beekeeping from one of the most famous bee biologists ever back in my undergrad days, and I have a friend who's a beekeeper, but I'm not. No, I'm mildly allergic to bees and chiggers and everything else.
Okay, let's see. We've got a question that came in. This is more about the flowers themselves. So
Yes.
the question was about how many bees can a flower feed? Or putting that in a different way, how many bees can feed on a flower before all the nectar and pollen are gone?
Well, I suppose it depends on the flower. I'm an entomologist. I'm not a botanist. And in fact, I'm not a bee biologist either. I really started working on pollinator conservation just in the last few graduate stages of my career. I know that once a flower is pollinated, so you look at a clover or something like that, it will quickly change. The petals begin to senesce. The plant is not going to continue to invest in a nectar supply if it doesn't need to. It's
Mhm.
going to conserve that energy. So I don't think it's going to be an open all-you-can-eat banquet long after the pollination services have been provided. It's really neat to see some of the adaptations that plants use. Something like, oh, I'm having a Prevagen moment on the species, but there are some plants with inflorescences that have lots of different individual flowers in the same flower head or same inflorescence, and they will change from yellow to red after they're
Mhm.
pollinated. Again, the bees don't recognize the red so much, but they can tell the yellow ones are still workable and still have a reward. So, I'm sure a magnolia flower feeds bees longer than, a tiny flower of a holly, but I don't know the answer. I'm sure it depends.
Yes, yeah. I
But
know.
it's not open season and all you can eat for any longer than it is necessary for the plant to invest in those floral rewards.
Absolutely. We do have several people have asked throughout the chat about the handouts you mentioned, so I just want to let people know they are linked actually several times throughout the chat. If you scroll through, you can find them, but we will be sending all of those links out with the recording. So you will receive them. Okay, some of the other questions. There was a question when you were talking about the diseases that are affecting bee health. What factors play into the increase in these diseases and the rise of these diseases among bees?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I didn't want to run over, so I took out some of the slides that I have on that topic when I talk about some other aspects of this. There are a variety of reasons why bee diseases are spreading. The commercial pollination side of it, for one thing, where we're taking bee colonies and loading them onto trucks, and then the colonies are crowded together and then they're moved from place to place on the commercial pollination routes, up to Maine to do cranberries or whatever up there, and then down to do apples, and perhaps down to Florida to do citrus, or in the West up to Washington State, and then down to California. So the bees are stressed. Don't know if they're coming or going. They're crowded together, which allows spread. The varroa mites transmit some of the diseases, some of the viruses are transmitted by the varroa mites, which of course can move from colony to colony when they're crowded together like that. There are other stressors as well, sublethal exposure to pesticides. I mean, when you think about a virus, we're more likely to come down with a virus if we're run down and if we're not feeling so well, our natural immune systems are compromised. And sublethal exposure to pesticides, climate change, I guess I'm allowed to say that since I'm not federally funded anymore. But climate change is putting a stress on bees, mainly through affecting the asynchrony between bloom and the bee emergences, and also the fact that, heck, our things aren't supposed to be blooming in January. There are other subtle reasons as well. As the beekeepers are losing more of their colonies, the honeybee colonies, they tend to take a higher percentage of the real honey and they supplement it with artificial bee food, which is essentially high fructose corn syrup. The research shows that real honey has antibodies in it, like colostrum does. Okay, so if you're feeding babies, colostrum's better than formula. Breast milk is better than formula for immunity. The same is true with real honey. And so when the beekeepers take more of the real honey from the bees because they're losing their colonies to the mites and things, and they replace it with the high fructose corn syrup, the baby bees aren't getting those antibodies that they normally get, and they become more susceptible to diseases. So it's a perfect storm of interacting things. But definitely the diseases are mostly exotic, invasive, and the mites play a big role.
Yeah, and actually a related question on the mites, perfect segue, was are the varroa mites and other mites affecting our native bees as well as honeybees?
As far as I know, varroa mites are pests of honeybees only. That's a really good question. There are mites that infest the colonies of bumblebees and things like that. I think there was recently a paper published in Science about some parasitic mites on bees other than honeybees. But the varroas are invasive mites, as far as I know, only affecting honeybees. And we know they're really important. I mean, the beekeepers know this. The only place that I believe they haven't found varroa mites is Australia, because it's an island, it's isolated, perhaps New Zealand as well. And they don't have a problem with the colony loss in Australia and New Zealand like we do in the United States. I realize that's correlation, but the varroa mites seem to be the main cause of the economic problems for honeybees in the United States.
Yes, I believe you're correct about New Zealand as well, not having varroa mites. See, so when you were recommending all of the plants, you made a lot of great plant recommendations. There was a question about the native and the non-native plants related to specialized bees. So for our bees that are specialized and have strong relationships with specific plants, how does that kind of relate to native and non-native plants?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. And someone's thinking like an ecologist. We looked at thousands and thousands of bees. I think we identified about 14 or 15,000 bees from our big survey. You know, a lot of them were honeybees, bumblebees, which are very common in urban settings. I think well over 95% of the bees that we identified from the survey were generalists. They were bees that feed upon a lot of different kinds of plants. So the variety was good for them. There are some bees that specialize on particular native plants, what certain wildflowers and things like that. And sure, you know, a seven sunflower is not going to provide what a spring active specialist andrenid bee might happen to need in April. That's why we want a variety. But the fact is that most of the bees that occur in urban landscape settings are bees that feed on a variety of different kinds, that gather nectar and pollen from a variety of different kinds of plants. They're generalists.
Right, right. So you'd be much more likely to find those specialized feeders in native habitat areas.
Yes, exactly. If I go to our nature center next week, which I will, and look at the great variety of wildflowers there, many of those are very specialized situations, but not so much in the urban landscape. Now, that said, that little resin bee that I showed you on the mock orange, I don't know that anybody's ever studied why that bee was so prevalent on mock orange or what it's doing with the resin that it gets from there. And I have no idea whether it's just a great source of resin that particular time when we sampled, and whether that bee is getting resin from other plants later in the year or not. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows in that case. But, you know, certainly if you look at just that one snapshot in time, that particular native bee seems to need mock orange, at least at that time of year. At least it seems to go there a lot. We didn't catch it on anything else.
With the specialized bees, is it more about the timing and they're familiar with those plants? Is it the pollen they're collecting? Is that the pollen, you know, what they're taking back for their nest in the next generation, or the nectar, or is it all of the above?
I think, again, I'm not a bee specialist. I'm a relative novice on this sort of thing. Full disclosure, in the forest where the wildflowers are here in Kentucky, a lot of those wildflowers bloom very early in the spring before the canopy closes. They're taking advantage of the sunlight before they're in the full shade. Many of them have unique phenology, if you will, and the bee phenology matches the flower phenology. So I think part of specialization is just being an opportunist. And there's some bees that they don't have a lot of competition because they're the ones that are out in late February, at the time when the trillium is out or whatever. I don't know, and my sense is I don't think that this necessarily some special vitamin or some special stuff in the nectar of this or that plant that the specialists have to have. Most of the studies I've seen is that in nectar's nectar, it contains a similar combination of different sugars, fructose, sucrose, and so on, maybe in different percentages, but nothing unique. But that's a good question. I'm obviously backpedaling here. I don't know what the basis is for specialization in bees, other than my sense is that there's a lot of it has to do with phenology and avoidance of competition. And I think the resins
Right.
can matter too. I mean, bees are probably using some of these resins as antibiotics in their nests, and there's some evidence that they can provide protection from fungal infections and things like that.
Mm. Yeah, somebody had made a comment that they use resin to make propolis. Is
Yeah,
that the antibiotic?
absolutely, that's correct. Propolis also contains antibiotics. I should have said that. It uses caulking to seal cracks and crevices and things like that, but it also contains antibiotics, and that's absolutely true.
All right. Just a couple more questions. So here's one. If you know the answer to this one, we all want to hear it. How can we make people feel better about carpenter bees when they're drilling into your home or deck?
I don't know, aluminum siding, I don't know. No, I mean, they are pests, and I have a wooden garage outside my window here, and I have been out there with my butterfly net catching the female carpenter bees and individually dispatching them only if I find them drilling into my garage. They are important pollinators, and you can manage them. We actually have a very good fact sheet on our University of Kentucky entomology website, UK entomology. Check it out. The website, my brother wrote a fact sheet on managing carpenter bees. So we don't have to kill them all out in the real world, but we can protect our garages. I don't know. They don't sting, I mean, they're not inordinately aggressive. The males will fly at you and scare you, much like cicada killer males. If you come into the carpenter bee's territory and he sees you moving, he may come and check you out, and you might think he's coming to sting you, but he's not. If you're buzzed by a carpenter bee, it's probably a stingless male. I wish I knew the answer. What do you think? You're an extension person.
No. Well, all of our extension publications say they don't cause a lot. It takes many years, for them to cause a lot of damage or to really be, a threat to structural damage to buildings. So, and they are pollinators. So I think those are the things that, get discussed a lot.
Well, they're important pollinators, and it's true you're not going to fall through your ceiling or anything or through your floor. But I do have holes in my garage facing, and I go out there and have to putty them up and everything and look good. It wrecks the paint. You can't always get what you want.
Right. And I believe the last question, you talked about many different wonderful plants, and we always want to encourage people to plant a diversity of plants and something for each season. But there was a question that asked, do you have a top three, or do you have any key favorites?
Yeah, I went through those plants really quickly because I didn't know exactly how much time I had or would take. But this is recorded, and there were lots of pretty pictures, and they're in that list of favorites.
Yeah.
Do I have favorites? I mean, yeah, sure I do. Among the non-natives, I love the Cornus moss and the Japanese carnal dogwood. The yellow ones in the spring are just gorgeous, and they're in bloom in February and early March here, and just getting the bees off to a great start. Among another non-natives, I love the Glossolabilia as a shrub. Even I can grow it. And I mean, I can see the bumblebee queens on it in October and November, like bears fattening up on berries going into hibernation. The seven sunflower is another non-native that I really like. Among the natives, of course, I like red maples, red bud. I have a beautiful red bud on my landscape serviceberry. I've read Robin Kimmerer's book, The Serviceberry. I know Robin. Our kids used to play together. And I like serviceberries. I mean, there's so many nice native ones that are wonderful.
All right. I think we have actually covered all of the questions related to your presentation. There were just a couple of questions I was going to mention that came in that were related more to the a Day of Giving, an Extension Master Gardener program. So there was somebody who mentioned that they have an Extension Master Gardener license plate, and we really appreciate that and wondered if that was part of Day of Giving. So if you have an Extension Master Gardener license plate, when you renew it or when you initially purchase it, there's an additional $10 fee that goes to our endowment. So when the DMV collects that, it automatically gets paid to our EMG endowment. So having your license plate and keeping it renewed helps build our endowment up, and we really appreciate that. And the other question was whether the Extension Master Gardener program is being affected by the lack of North Carolina having a state budget. So I think if you asked our legislatures, they would say we do have a budget. It's just last year's the budget from the last budget cycle. They just haven't approved a new budget. And I would say, all of Extension and the university and all of our public universities are being affected by not having a new budget just because there's a lot of uncertainty around what is the funding going to be. So one of the most visible impacts I think we all see of that is it's really slowed down hiring, bringing on new positions, refilling positions as they empty. So we do all hope to have a state budget soon. The other two questions that came in.
Yeah, we have the same problems here in Kentucky, of course, and hopefully it'll get better. Yeah, support your local university,
Yeah.
your local arboretum. Yeah. Oh, other favorite plants. It just came to mind. I like buttonbush. It's really cool. Bottlebrush buckeye is another one that's wonderful. There's so many.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key is we always want to encourage people to plant a variety of plants, have something in bloom all throughout the growing season, especially those early and late times of the year.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed the slide you had about how imagining a tree and if it was spread out across a meadow, I think that really kind of brought it home how woody plants just bring so many resources and like vertically versus low growing flowers spread out horizontally, they just aren't delivering the volume that a woody plant can deliver. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate everything you shared with us. It was excellent and thought-provoking, and I know we will all add new plants to our landscapes, bring more woody plants to our landscape, and have just grown our knowledge and appreciation for pollinators and how we can protect them.
Charlotte, thank you for the invitation again, and I hope the folks enjoy the handouts.
Absolutely. And we will be getting those out in the next day or two with the recording. I believe I have shared my screen again, just saying a heartfelt thank you to everybody who has made a gift today on Day of Giving. And of course, it's not too late. So if you are able, we really appreciate it, but we do appreciate everything all of our volunteers do to support the program and their communities across North Carolina. Thank you to everyone.